Welcome, everyone, to this week's lecture, Gods and Men, Eurasian Cultural Traditions. We start here with an image, a bas-relief carving of the Buddha's first sermon. This dates back to roughly the 2nd and 3rd century CE, that is about 1800 years old now, is this image. And it shows the Buddha seated in the lotus position, surrounded by obviously adoring and revering characters, all of them in some fashion imitating the robed look of the Buddha himself. Note this came from the kingdom known as the Kushan kingdom, north of India, which in that period was one of the vestigial leftover polities of Alexander the Great. And it was during his campaigns of conquest that Alexander left behind some of his own Greek lieutenants and commanders to take charge of what would become the Kushan kingdom. And so there's a decidedly Greek look here to the Buddha. That is, his robes appear to be in the style of the Greek robed figure, even though the Buddha himself was native to India. And so right away, without even jumping into the lecture yet, we have a nice example of how, in this case, a religious tradition will come together, borrowing different cultural parts, if you will. In this case, some of them Greek, other component parts Indian, and as Buddhism as a religion will continue to grow across the Silk Roads into China, Southeast Asia, and eventually Japan, you'll see the Buddha reinterpreted again and again in the kind of ethnocentric costume and guise of whatever particular region begins to follow Buddhism. So the Buddha, looking here rather Greek, will then become progressively more Chinese or even Southeast Asian. Eventually, in some of the Japanese Buddhist sects, he'll take on a more Japanese appearance. And so, there's an old saying that God, an old biblical intonation, that God created man in his image. But one of the things we're going to see here today is that often man has created God in his particular cultural and ethnic image. And that's what we're studying in this lecture, Gods and Men, not only the beginnings of great religions in this period, but also great philosophical systems. So some of the great world religions and philosophies will arise in this first millennium BCE, what I like to call the big ideas from the first millennium BCE. And when we start to just make a list, really, of world religions and philosophical systems that emerge during this period, it's hard not to wonder exactly, what was going on. From 1000 BCE to the time of Jesus, civilizations of Eurasia contributed to a classical era of religion and philosophy. Some of the fundamental ideas that have guided human worship and ethical thinking for over 2,000 years until our own day, in fact, were given classic expression during this period. Here you see the artist Jacques-Louis David from 1787, his painting called The Death of Socrates. And here in the center of the image is the Greek philosopher, 5th century Greek philosopher, Socrates. And why? Why in this 1,000-year period? Now, I know you might be thinking, well, listen, 1,000 years is a long time. Is that such a coincidence? Well, again, we have to use our world history timeline. Our species, we've dated back to 250,000 years, even if we take from the cognitive revolution, when our big box brains became increasingly creative and imaginative, some 40,000 years ago. Why during this relatively concentrated period roughly from the year 1000 BCE to the period CE, why is so much packed into it? In other words, after 39,000 years, why does so much get packed up into this period in terms of great intellectual, religious, philosophical traditions? Why not after 20,000 years, or after 25,000 years? Essentially, if we chart the cognitive revolution from 40,000 years ago, it took about 37,000 years before we get this great burst of intellectual and creative activity. So yeah, let's ask, why? Why was civilization just then addressing the fundamental questions of human existence? As your textbook author Robert Strayer asks, are ideas generated by particular political, social, and economic conditions? Or are they the product of creative human imagination independent of the material environment? In other words, nature or nurture? Is it something in our world that inspires us to have these thoughts? Or do these thoughts, are they inborn to our own intellects? That is the product, as he says, of creative human imagination, independent of the material environment. Well, it's a good question, and it's one that we're going to spend some time with now in this lecture on gods and men. And this is just the first part. You'll follow with part 2, and then parts 3 and 4 next week. Now, some historians look to material explanations and what I call the ecology of civilizations. That's actually a term I have borrowed, with full disclosure, the ecology of civilizations. It's a term I like a lot, and it's a term I first read in the writings of the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto. So giving credit where it's due to this idea of the ecology of civilizations. And we used that phrase when we were looking at the first civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. We said of Egypt, for example, that Egyptian civilization was largely the product of the Nile River Valley and the material elements that were available to Egyptians as a result of their particular ecosystem. So keeping that idea going here now to talk about how the ecology of civilizations influence, among other things, great ideas that those civilizations produced. And the image you see here are coins from the Iron Age. This period, by the way, from 1000 BCE to the figurative year 0, if you will, there really is no year 0, it would be 1000 BCE to the year 1 BCE in the calendaring of all this, is known as the Iron Age. And these coins you see here come from the Iron Age. And so there's some thought that this may give us a clue as to why so many great ideas, so many deep and brilliant and long-lasting philosophical and religious ideas are born of this age. You'll recall that in the second millennium BCE, that is from 2000 to 1000 BCE, known as the Bronze Age, that bronze technology had made possible lots of advancements in warfare, in travel, in exchange, and thus created a new basis of wealth for the civilizations of the Bronze Age. Well, the Bronze Age, as we also know, ended in a cloudburst of conflict, of war, particularly in the Mediterranean, of war between the great states of the age, between Egypt, for example, and the Indo-Aryan civilizations of what is now modern-day Turkey. That is, the collision of these civilizations along with the invading presence of the so-called sea peoples or Mediterranean peoples, all of which created the end of the Bronze Age as we know it. That is, when the Hittites and the Egyptians and the invading sea peoples all found themselves embroiled in wars, ultimately the basis for those civilizations failed, giving way to a kind of interim or transitional period that we conveniently mark as the Iron Age. So from bronze to iron, new technologies arising, new methods, that is, for the forging of melted iron ores into what were stronger farm tools, yielding deeper furrows and more productive agriculture, relieving the burdens of daily existence. That is better farming due to better tools. Stronger iron weapons mean more deadly warfare. More people dying on the battlefield, raising questions of life and death. Stronger weapons allow for new empires that enforce order over wide areas, giving rise to questions, fundamental questions of justice and law and governance. And finally, iron technology itself requiring more sophisticated understanding of nature, especially chemistry and physics. Remember, you're melting ore in a forge and combining trace elements to create the desired metallic result. All of this encourages new directions in technology, math, and science. And so a deeper exploration of nature, then, that science brings. All of these elements, these bulleted points here, relieving the burdens of daily existence, more deadly warfare, bigger governing regions, giving questions to justice and law, and finally the technology itself requiring greater sophistication in science and math. All of this is put forward in some historical arguments as being contributing causes now to man's deeper search into the fundamentals of our existence. That is, no longer does it seem mankind is satisfied to live in a world in which great events of nature, of weather, of climate, or even questions of war and such are simply attributed to a gallery of gods, who use human beings as their playthings, the kind of Bronze Age pantheon of gods that we saw, enshrined in the works of Homer and the mythologies of the Greeks. No, it seemed that man was now more emboldened, more empowered to look into those kinds of questions, to make those kinds of inquiries on his own. Now, that's due to material circumstances. Other historians, that is, focus on what we might call cultural developments. The development and spread of intellectual movements was common to all the Eurasian literate societies from which the great thinkers come. So we're talking about Eurasia. We're talking about the full breadth of the continent of Eurasia, that is, from the Chinese kingdoms of the east all the way to the Greek and Roman Mediterranean in the west. That is this Eurasian circuit, if you will, of people and trade and exchange and ideas, which include now in this first millennium literacy. That is, written sources that can be read and shared by travelers. Let me give you some examples here. It's generally considered that writing in the first century, or the first millennium, BCE, that writing, in particular the reproduction of writing. Look, we've seen writing already now from the time of Mesopotamian cuneiform, but now in the first millennium BCE, we see the Chinese creating a form of reproducing what's written. That is, the invention, basically, of printed sources. Chinese text characters here on the left from the Analects, teachings of the Chinese philosopher Confucius. Scrolls in the case of the Hebrew people above here, showing what were often religious writings printed onto scrolls. Sometimes the material was neither Chinese paper or Hebrew papyrus scrolls, but in this case, rock itself. In the case of the old Persian, rock inscriptions from the Persian Empire, showing the Zoroastrian symbol here, the great religious motif of dynastic Persian religion. So, in a variety of medium, you might say, or formats, writing and the ability to reproduce writing, if not yet actual mechanical printing, that will come a bit later. Nevertheless, the ability to emboss different kinds of transportable surfaces. Now, nobody was transporting this rock carving, which, by the way, was inscribed. You can't see it clearly here, but inscribed in 3 different languages, the diktats of the Persian king, that is, the edicts and rulings of the Persian king. But you didn't have to move the rock because it happened to be positioned along a highway that connected 2 great commercial realms of Western Asia, from Persia to Mesopotamia. And so travelers, merchants, traders, commercial people, and others traveling along the road, think of it as an ancient billboard almost, for the edicts of the Persian king. Perhaps a combination of these influences, that is to say, material, scientific, technological, cultural, combine, right, to give greater frequency of information, that is the exchange of information, a cultural exchange, which will then stimulate greater intellectual activity. What I mean is that if we look at a map here of Eurasia, from the Chinese kingdoms of the East, as I say, to the Mediterranean world, we can see the possibility for exchange along the various trade routes, caravan routes, merchant routes, and even sailing routes. The coastal traders of Southeast Asia, of Malaysia, and the Spice Islands, of India here, of the Arabian Sea and the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea, all the way to the Mediterranean, that we're talking about the possibility now of travel and exchange, where peoples from one region will interact with peoples from another region, will share ideas, exchange information, and ultimately create the building blocks of these intellectual traditions, be they religious. And again, I like the Buddha example here, because though the Buddha himself as a historical person, Siddhartha, the prince, the young prince of northern India, though he is from, that is, the man who will come to promulgate the tenets of Buddhism, is from northern India. The Kushan state here, just north of India, sees the interaction between 2 regions, and from Kushan into China, across the Himalayan range into Southeast Asia, eventually, as I said before, Japan. And so we're talking about people on the move who are carrying trade goods, who are carrying technologies, but also they're carrying ideas. The Kushan people lived in the mountainous northwest of the Indian subcontinent and Afghanistan, and their art combines influences from India, Persia, Greece, and China. I talked about the Greek influence before. Scholars call this syncretism, and it's one of our really important key words for this lecture, but really for our entire semester. So I want you to double underline it. Syncretism, the blending of different religions or schools of thought, is a common element in many of these religious and philosophical systems. So yeah, it means blending from different regions, blending from different cultures, blending of different ideas into new syntheses of thought, of philosophy, of religion. And all of them, as we'll see, will have their syncretic elements. Now here's a handy chart that your author Robert Strayer has put together. Religion and philosophy develop, as we've said, with growing sophistication, and often place more responsibility on individuals for knowing and following principles of ethical and moral behavior. What Strayer has done here is created a kind of handy list starting with the central figure of a particular tradition, be it religious or philosophical. So in the Persian religious tradition, Zoroaster; among the Hebrews, the prophets, Isaiah, Amos, Jeremiah, among others; the anonymous writers of the Indian Upanishads; a figure like Confucius in China, or Mahavira in India, Mahavira being the titular founder of Jainism; Siddhartha, we mentioned before, as the Buddha; Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi in Taoism, the Chinese philosophical and religious tradition; and then the familiar names like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, among the Greek rationalists of the 5th century; Jesus of Nazareth, a founding figure, identifying central figure of what becomes Christianity; or even St. Paul, that is, Paul of Tarsus, who becomes then a central figure in the spread of the Christian gospel. So from Zoroastrianism to Christianity, with philosophical traditions in between, such as Confucianism and Greek rationalism. Now, I guess before we go any farther, we should try to differentiate between religion and philosophy, and we're going to do it in the simplest way. What we call religion, for example, is a system of ideas promulgated by teachers, spread by followers, often recorded by students of the various figures we see here in Robert Strayer's chart. What's different from philosophy about these ideas is that in religion there are claims of divine knowledge, that is, of supernatural connection to the natural world. It's a religion if it has ideas that touch upon those supernatural claims, ideas of divinity, ideas of celestial return, of life beyond the natural world. Any of those things then qualify the system of ideas as a religion, whereas philosophy, for our purposes, will be those systems of ideas that make no claim beyond the natural world, but instead address the concerns and questions of this world. So sometimes it's assumed, I think by Westerners, that Confucius was the founder of a religion called Confucianism, but that's not the case. Confucianism concerns itself with ethical and moral questions in this lifetime and makes no particular claim beyond this lifetime. Nothing about a transcendent deity, for example, in Confucianism. Now, something like Christianity, of course, will be rather different. That is, by the time St. Paul is preaching the tenets of Christianity, it has been already concluded that the principal figure of that system, Jesus of Nazareth, is himself a divine being. And there will be differences of opinion among early Christians about the exact nature of Jesus' divinity, but all will agree that he is a divine being, which is enough to make Christianity then a religion and not a philosophy. Somewhere in between would be something like Chinese Taoism. And I say that because Lao Tzu, who is the founder, the reputed founder of Taoism, was seen as a sage, was seen as a philosopher, certainly, but not seen, therefore, as a transcendent being, not, say, like Jesus of Nazareth, who becomes not only the Christ, but among his followers understood to be a Godhead, whether as it comes later in the Roman tradition to be promulgated as part of a trinity of Godheads, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, for example. Lao Tzu is seen as a philosopher, but over time over time, the followers of Taoism will come to promulgate a kind of divine status for Lao Tzu's teachings, that is, the teachings of Taoism, and will begin to erect temples and religious rites associated with those teachings. There will be a kind of priesthood, even, that rises up to become the official teachers of Taoism. And so, if you travel today in China, or even better yet, in Taiwan, where many of those temples are still, preserved, you'll see what in effect ultimately becomes religious about Taoism as opposed to purely philosophical. So yeah, that's how we're going to do it. That's the dividing line we're going to make between religion and philosophy. And I guess I would have to admit that these lines are not always completely well defined, but for our purposes they'll work. So that when we talk about philosophy, we're talking about affairs of this world, and as we talk about religion, we're talking about affairs that extend into some celestial world beyond the natural world. So, whether addressing the affairs of this world or the realm of the divine, teachers and prophets across Eurasia, from Buddha to Socrates, address fundamental questions of human existence, and they do so within about the same 500-year period. Here, once again, is our friend Socrates, as he was imagined in one marbled sculpture. And perhaps fitting is it that he was depicted in marble. By tradition, is thought that Socrates himself was a stonemason from Athens, Greece, who became famous teaching a secular philosophy of ethics and moral behavior, famously to the young of Athens, inspired by what he said were concepts, fundamental concepts, such as justice and good government. Interestingly enough, his near contemporary Confucius, all the way across the Eurasian continent in China, was also teaching likewise lessons in social harmony, in good government, and ethical behavior. So both of these figures from opposite ends of the continent were roughly at the same time concerning themselves and their followers with these deeper inquiries into the philosophical basis for good living, good governing, and human society. And again, do we see that as just a coincidence that after 37,000 years these two would pop up? Or do we see it as a combination of those other qualities I talked about at the beginning? Among other things, it was possible for the teachings of Confucius and Socrates to survive because they were ultimately written down and preserved in the technology of writing and record keeping, just as the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth will be, and others who appeared on that list, the precepts of the Buddha. And it's almost among a community of followers, always among a community of followers, that the teachings of the master, of the primary teacher, will be recorded, usually, in fact, after the person has died. That is, coming out of an oral tradition where these things are spoken, these precepts, these lessons, these gospels, etc., are spoken, and only through the technology of written records and writing itself, then, in this Iron Age, will we see those teachings, those precepts, those gospels preserved after the life of the individual teacher. So, a growing conception of mankind's responsibilities. As your textbook author Robert Strayer writes, all of these traditions sought an alternative to an earlier polytheism in which the activities of various gods and spirits explained what happened in this world. And if you think back to Mesopotamia, it often seemed that the works of the gods, the gods of the sky, of the sun, the moon, the stars, of the water, the rain, of the storm, etc., that these polytheistic gods often worked in ways that were almost inscrutable. You didn't know why the flood came to Babylon, only that the gods must have willed it. An image of Confucius from that early period, CE. Now we begin to get explanations for these things, whether it be religion trying to account for those cosmic issues, or a philosopher like Confucius trying to account, for the catastrophes we bring on ourselves, that is war and governing and that sort of thing. The task of humankind, says Strayer, according to these new ways of thinking, was personal, moral, or spiritual transformation, often expressed as the development of compassion by aligning ourselves with a higher order. So if the Mesopotamian gods seemed entirely arbitrary, cruel, and capricious, now the deep thinkers of the age were trying to ground fundamental precepts of law and order and morality and justice in the affairs, the rational affairs of mankind. Even if we look at the Hebrew tradition, as represented by the Renaissance artist Rembrandt here, of Moses with the law tablets, the famous Mosaic Code, which is a rather early part of the Hebrew tradition. But the very idea that these precepts were recorded and preserved and then taught among followers is enough to make Moses a kind of spiritual godfather now to this axial age of great philosophy and great religion. All right, so that is part one of our lecture, Gods and Men, just setting the table and introducing some of the players, you might say. You'll see in part two, we look more into the historical process. And, that's the point I want to leave you with today. It may be the case that some of you are Buddhist, some of you are Christian or Jewish or even Muslim. That is the three traditions that combine Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions in what becomes the ongoing religious tradition now with its roots in this period. Maybe you consider yourself a rationalist, in the order of the Greeks. But whatever the case is, these are all systems now that have their roots, their fundamental roots in this same 500-year period. We say a millennium, but really, if you go back and look at Strayer's chart, it's even more constrained than that. It's about a 500-year period within that millennium. And so, although, let's say, as a worshiper of one of these faiths, you don't necessarily think of the cosmic claims that it makes as being grounded in some particular historical context. But we said at the beginning of our course this semester that though history cannot claim supernatural evidence as its own, history can treat what is historical about mythologies and religions. And what we find in this period is that the groundwork, beginning with the teachings themselves, with the historical figure, with the Buddha, with Jesus of Nazareth, or even the Greek rationalists, that we can find the historical figure that then becomes the font for the subsequent historically observable ordering of collecting the teachings, of preaching the teachings, of bringing them all together into some recognizable religious, say, movement. That we can see in history. We still can't pass judgment. We still can't say, well, this one is right and that one is wrong, because then we're appealing once again to something that is supernatural. But what historians can do is say, see, here's where it begins with a teacher. Here's where it continues with a group of followers who have written the teachings down. Here's where it expands into something like a movement. This takes time and it works through history. You don't get something like an identifiable, broad-based Christian movement for many decades after the death of Jesus, you don't get anything like a global movement of something called Christianity for many centuries after that. So this is something then that unfolds in history, and it's that unfolding that we'll come back to in part two.